Let's begin by understanding the internal world of the avoidant, because without that, everything else in this dynamic gets misinterpreted. The avoidant is not cold, not indifferent, and certainly not incapable of love. What they are, at their core, is protective, highly protective. Their primary driver is not connection, it's safety. And for them, emotional exposure does not feel safe. You have to understand that for an avoidant, vulnerability is not just uncomfortable, it's threatening. Somewhere along the line, whether through early relationships, inconsistent caregiving, or emotional overwhelm, they learned a fundamental lesson. Closeness comes at a cost. It might mean losing autonomy, being judged, being controlled, or even being hurt in ways they couldn't process at the time. So what do? They adapt. They become self-reliant. They minimize needs. They build a world where they are in control of their emotional environment. And control is everything here. An avoidant carefully regulates how much of themselves they reveal, when they reveal it, and to whom. It's not random, it's strategic. They may appear calm, even detached, but that calmness is often a managed state. It's the result of keeping emotional intensity at arm's length. Because once things get too deep, too fast, or too unpredictable, their internal alarm system goes off. Now here's where most people misunderstand them. When an avoidant pulls back, it's often interpreted as disinterest or rejection. But in reality, it's regulation. It's their way of restoring equilibrium. It's how they prevent themselves from feeling engulfed. Because for them, too much emotional closeness can feel like losing themselves entirely. Think about that for a moment. For someone who equates intimacy with a loss of identity, even genuine love can feel dangerous. Even care can feel like pressure. Even connection can feel like a trap. So they create space, physical space, emotional space, sometimes even silence. Not because they don't feel, but because they feel too much, too quickly, and don't trust the environment enough to stay open within it. And this is where the tension begins to build in relationships. Because while the avoidant is trying to maintain safety through distance, the other person often experiences that distance as abandonment. And the more the other person moves closer to close that gap, the more the avoidant feels their boundaries being tested. Not intentionally, but experientially. So what you end up with is a paradox. The avoidant wants connection, but only at a pace and depth that feels safe. They want intimacy, but without losing autonomy. They want to be understood, but without being fully exposed. And that's a very narrow window to operate within. If you don't recognize this, you'll misread their behavior. You'll think they're playing games, when in reality, they're managing fear. You'll think they're emotionally unavailable, when in truth, they're selectively available in order to protect themselves. This is the foundation. This is the core fear. Emotional exposure equals potential loss of control, of identity, of safety. And until you truly grasp that, every interaction with an avoidant will feel confusing, inconsistent, even contradictory, because you're looking at their behavior, but you're not seeing the protection behind it. And here's the truth that reframes everything. The avoidant doesn't fear connection. They fear what connection might take away from them. Now, on the other side of this dynamic, we encounter a very different psychological force, the toxic empath. And this is where things get subtle, because at first glance, this person appears to be everything we're taught to value. They're emotionally aware, deeply intuitive, highly attuned to the needs of others. They listen closely, they observe carefully, and they often seem to understand people on a level that feels rare. But here's the distinction we have to make, and it's a critical one. There is a difference between empathy that respects boundaries and empathy that overrides them. A toxic empath doesn't just feel what others feel. They assume responsibility for it. They don't simply connect. They absorb, interpret, and often insert themselves into the emotional experience of another person. And while this can look like care on the surface, underneath it is something far more complex. There is often an unconscious need to be needed, to be central, to be the one who understands you better than you understand yourself. And that's where the problem begins. Because when empathy becomes fused with identity, it stops being a tool for connection and starts becoming a mechanism for control. Not control in the obvious, manipulative sense, but in a more insidious way. The toxic empath believes, often genuinely, that their depth of understanding gives them access, even entitlement, to another person's inner world. They'll say things like, "I know what you're feeling," or "You don't have to hide from me," or "I can see right through you." And again, it sounds comforting, it sounds supportive, but to someone who values emotional autonomy, like the avoidant, we're not talking about comfort, we're talking about intrusion, because what the toxic empath is doing, often without realizing it, is bypassing consent. They are stepping into emotional territory that hasn't been freely offered. They are decoding, analyzing, and sometimes confronting feelings that the other person has not chosen to share. And when that happens, something very important is lost: agency. Healthy empathy says, "I'm here with you." Toxic empathy says, "I know you even if you haven't chosen to be known." That's a completely different dynamic. One invites connection, the other imposes it. Now layer in intensity. The toxic empath doesn't operate at a moderate emotional level. They go deep. Quickly. They want to understand your past, your wounds, your fears, your patterns, and not over time, not gradually, but now. There's a sense of urgency, a pull toward emotional depth that can feel overwhelming, especially to someone who regulates through distance. And here's the paradox: they believe they're helping. They believe that by pushing for openness, by encouraging vulnerability, by holding space, they are creating intimacy. But in reality, they are often accelerating a process that requires pacing, trust, and mutual agreement. They confuse access with closeness and intensity with connection. So what you end up with is a form of care that doesn't feel like care to the person receiving it. It feels like pressure. It feels like being seen before you're ready to be seen. It feels like someone is reaching into parts of you that you're still trying to understand yourself. And this is why the avoidant doesn't experience the toxic empath as safe, even though everything about them seems emotionally intelligent. Because safety is not just about being understood. It's about being respected in the process of being understood. And when that respect is missing, when empathy becomes invasive rather than invitational, it stops being connection and starts becoming a violation. And that's the shift you have to recognize. Empathy without boundaries isn't compassion. It's control disguised as care. Once you understand these two inner worlds, the avoidant's need for safety and the toxic empath's need for emotional immersion, you can start to see how the interaction between them becomes almost inevitable. Not accidental, not random, but patterned. Because what one protects against is exactly what the other pursues. The avoidant creates space to regulate. The toxic empath closes space to connect. And this is where the dynamic shifts into something far more intense. Relentless emotional pursuit. Now let's be precise with that word, relentless. This is not casual interest. This is not a balanced effort to build connection over time. This is a sustained, often escalating drive to access the emotional core of another person. The toxic empath doesn't just want to know you. They want to feel you fully and immediately. They seek emotional transparency, constant communication, and a depth of interaction that bypasses the natural pacing of trust. And when they sense distance, hesitation, or withdrawal, they don't interpret it as a boundary. They interpret it as a problem to solve. So what do? They lean in harder. They ask more questions. They initiate more conversations. They analyze the silence, the pauses, the subtle shifts in tone. They reach out again and again and again, sometimes under the belief that persistence is proof of care, that if they just stay present, just keep showing up, they'll break through whatever wall is in front of them. But to the avoidant, this doesn't feel like dedication. It feels like pressure, because every additional attempt at closeness, every push for deeper emotional engagement begins to activate that internal alarm system we talked about earlier. The one that says you're losing control, you're being pulled into something you can't regulate. And here's where the misalignment becomes critical. The toxic empath believes that distance means disconnection. The avoidant experiences distance as necessary regulation. So when the empath moves closer to fix the perceived disconnection, they're unknowingly intensifying the very response they're trying to resolve. It becomes a feedback loop. The more the empath pursues, the more the avoidant withdraws. The more the avoidant withdraws, the more the empath feels compelled to pursue. Each person believes they are responding appropriately to the situation, but neither realizes they are reinforcing it. And what makes this even more complex is the emotional narrative behind it. The toxic empath often tells themselves, I'm just trying to connect. I'm trying to help. I'm showing them they're not alone. There is sincerity in that. But sincerity does not eliminate impact. Because from the avoidance perspective, it doesn't matter what the intention is. What matters is how it feels. And it feels like being chased emotionally. Imagine constantly being asked to go deeper, to open more, to respond faster, to engage more intensely than you're comfortable with. Imagine feeling like your natural pace is never enough, that your silence is analyzed, your space is questioned, your boundaries are interpreted as resistance rather than respected as limits. That's not connection. That's pressure wrapped in concern. And over time, that pressure doesn't create openness. It creates avoidance at a higher level. The avoidant doesn't just pull back slightly, they begin to shut down more completely. Communication becomes shorter. Engagement becomes minimal. In some cases, they disappear entirely. Not because they don't care, but because the environment no longer feels manageable. And this is the tragedy of the dynamic. The very thing the empath is trying to create, closeness, is the exact thing they end up pushing further away. Because connection cannot be forced into existence. It cannot be accelerated beyond what both people can hold, and it certainly cannot be sustained through pressure. At some point, you have to recognize that pursuit, no matter how well-intentioned, can become intrusion when it ignores the other person's capacity. And that leads us to a hard but necessary truth. When connection is chased without restraint, it stops being an invitation and starts becoming an invasion. As this dynamic continues to unfold, what becomes increasingly clear is that we're not just dealing with different personalities. We're dealing with fundamentally different relationships to boundaries. And this is where the tension sharpens, because boundaries are not just behavioral preferences. They are psychological survival strategies. For the avoidant, boundaries are walls, deliberate, structured, and often non-negotiable. These walls are not there to keep people out for the sake of isolation. They're there to maintain a sense of internal order. They define where the self ends and the other begins. They protect time, energy, emotional bandwidth. Without these walls, the avoidant doesn't feel connected. They feel exposed. And exposure to them is instability, so they build carefully. They control access. They decide when to engage, how much to reveal, how quickly to move. And when those boundaries are respected, something interesting happens. They soften gradually on their terms, because safety for them is not created through intensity. It's created through consistency and respect. Now contrast that with the toxic empath. The toxic empath doesn't experience boundaries as protective. They experience them as barriers to connection. To them, boundaries can feel unnecessary, even counterproductive. If the goal is closeness, why limit access? If the intention is understanding, why hold back? So instead of reinforcing boundaries, they tend to blur them. They move into emotional spaces quickly. They share deeply, often very early. They encourage others to do the same. And when they encounter resistance, when someone says, I'm not ready, or I need space, they don't always interpret that as a valid boundary. They interpret it as fear or avoidance or something that needs to be gently pushed through. And this is where the collision happens, because what the avoidant experiences as a necessary boundary, the toxic empath experiences as a problem to solve. And what the toxic empath sees as an act of care, leaning in, staying present, encouraging openness, the avoidant experiences as a breach. It's not just a difference in behavior, it's a difference in philosophy. One says, respect my limits so I can trust you. The other says, let me past your limits so I can reach you. and both believe they are acting in the name of connection. But here's the critical issue. When boundaries are not mutually understood, they don't just get crossed, they get invalidated. And once a boundary is invalidated, the person who set it no longer feels safe expressing it again. So what does the avoidant do? They reinforce, they thicken the walls, they become less expressive, less available, less engaged, not out of defiance, but out of necessity. Because if a boundary isn't respected at a moderate level, it will be enforced at a stronger one. And from the toxic empath's perspective, this escalation feels confusing, even hurtful. They might think, I'm trying to get closer. Why are they pulling away? But what they're not seeing is that their method of getting closer is the very thing creating the distance. Because connection is not built by removing someone's boundaries. It's built by proving that those boundaries will be honored. Without that, there is no trust, only tension. And this is where many relationships get stuck. One person keeps pushing for openness, believing it will lead to intimacy. The other keeps withdrawing, believing it will preserve safety. And neither realizes that the solution is not more effort in their current direction, but a shift in understanding. Because boundaries are not obstacles to connection. They are the conditions that make connection possible. And if you ignore that, if you treat someone's limits as something to overcome rather than something to respect, you don't create closeness. You create resistance. And that brings us to a principle that, once understood, changes everything. Where boundaries are not honored, connection does not deepen, it collapses. By this point, you can probably feel the pattern taking shape. It's no longer just about isolated behaviors or misunderstandings. It's a system, a self-reinforcing loop that feeds on the very instincts each person believes are necessary for connection and protection. And this is where the dynamic evolves into what can only be described as a push-pull cycle of chaos. Because once these patterns lock in, they begin to operate almost automatically. The toxic empath senses distance and responds with pursuit. The avoidant senses pressure and responds with withdrawal. And each reaction becomes the trigger for the next. It's not planned. It's not even fully conscious most of the time. It's patterned, and patterns, when left unexamined, become predictable. At first, this cycle can feel almost magnetic. The empath is drawn to the avoidant's depth, their mystery, their restraint. There's something compelling about someone who doesn't reveal everything at once. It creates intrigue, a sense of discovery, and for the avoidant, there can be an initial appreciation for the empath's openness, their emotional fluency, their willingness to engage. It feels in the beginning like balance, but that balance is fragile because it's built on opposing coping mechanisms, not shared emotional frameworks. And over time, those differences don't complement each other. They collide. So the empath leans in, trying to deepen the connection, trying to sustain the emotional momentum. And the avoidant, feeling that momentum accelerate beyond their comfort zone, begins to pull back, maybe subtly at first. Slower responses, less initiation, a bit more distance. And the empath notices. Of course they do. They're highly attuned. They pick up on the shift immediately. And because they interpret distance as disconnection, they move closer. They increase effort. They try to reestablish what they felt was there. But that increased effort doesn't restore balance. It intensifies the pressure. So the avoidant pulls back further. Now we're no longer in subtle territory. Now the gap is visible. Communication becomes strained. One person is reaching, the other is retreating, and both are beginning to feel something deeper than confusion. The empath feels rejection. The avoidant feels suffocation. And here's where the emotional narratives start to solidify. The empath begins to think, I'm giving so much. Why isn't it enough? They may feel unappreciated, unseen, even hurt by what seems like emotional unavailability. Meanwhile, the avoidant is thinking, nothing I do creates space. No matter how much I pull back, it's not respected. They begin to feel overwhelmed, pressured, even trapped. So both escalate, but in opposite directions. The empath pushes harder for clarity, for reassurance, for emotional presence. The avoidant withdraws more completely, sometimes shutting down communication altogether. And at this stage, the cycle becomes exhausting, not just emotionally, but psychologically, because neither person feels understood. Both feel like they're responding appropriately to the situation, yet the outcome keeps deteriorating. And that's the hallmark of a dysfunctional loop. Effort increases, but results decline. Eventually, something gives. Either the empath reaches a point of emotional burnout, feeling like they've given everything without receiving stability in return, or the avoidant reaches a point of complete shutdown, where disengagement feels like the only way to restore internal balance. And when that happens, the connection doesn't just weaken, it fractures. But what's important to understand is that this outcome was not caused by a lack of care. In many cases, both people cared deeply. It was caused by incompatible strategies for handling closeness and distance, each one unintentionally amplifying the other. And this is the part most people miss. It's not the presence of emotion that creates chaos. It's the misalignment of how that emotion is expressed and managed. Because when one person equates love with pursuit and the other equates safety with distance, every attempt at connection becomes a point of friction. And that friction, over time, doesn't resolve itself. It compounds. Until finally, you're not in a relationship, you're in a cycle. And here's the reality that cuts through all of it. When two people trigger each other's defenses more than they support each other's growth, the connection doesn't evolve, it repeats. And when you step back and look at this entire dynamic from a wider lens, something becomes unmistakably clear. Despite how intense it feels, despite how personal it becomes, despite how much emotion is invested on both sides, neither person is actually getting what they need. This is why, at its core, this dynamic becomes a kind of psychological nightmare. Not because one person is right and the other is wrong, but because both are operating from unmet needs, using strategies that guarantee those needs will remain unmet. The avoidant, who is trying to preserve safety, ends up feeling increasingly unsafe. What begins as a desire to maintain control over their emotional world turns into a constant need to defend it. They become hyper-aware of intrusion, hypersensitive to pressure, and over time, even genuine attempts at connection start to feel like threats. So they retreat further, not realizing that the more they withdraw, the more they reinforce the very dynamic they're trying to escape. And internally, this creates its own kind of exhaustion, because the avoidant is not free in this pattern. They're confined by it. They may have space, but it's not peaceful space. It's guarded space. It's space that requires vigilance. Every interaction carries the question, is this going to demand more from me than I can give? And when that becomes the dominant lens, connection starts to feel like a liability rather than a possibility. Now look at the toxic empath. On the surface, they are the one pursuing, the one expressing, the one trying to hold the relationship together. But underneath that effort is a growing sense of emotional depletion, because no matter how much they give, how much they try to understand, how much they show up, it never seems to create the consistency they're looking for. And that leads to a very specific kind of pain, not just rejection, but confusion. Why doesn't this work? Why can't they see how much I care? What else do I need to do? And in that confusion, they often double down on the very behavior that's creating the distance. More effort, more intensity, more emotional reach. But the return keeps diminishing. So now they feel unappreciated, unseen, even taken for granted. And over time, that can shift into resentment. Because when care is not reciprocated in the way it's given, it stops feeling like generosity. It starts feeling like loss. And this is the moment where both people are fully entangled in the same outcome, even though they took completely different paths to get there. The avoidant feels overwhelmed and trapped. The toxic empath feels rejected and drained. And neither recognizes that the dynamic itself is the problem, because it's easy to personalize this. It's easy to say, and this person is too much, or this person is not enough. But those interpretations miss the deeper truth. The issue is not the intensity of one or the distance of the other. It's the lack of alignment in how safety and connection are defined. One person finds safety in space. The other finds safety in closeness. And without awareness, those definitions will always clash. So what happens? The relationship becomes a place where both people are trying to survive rather than a place where both people can grow. And when survival becomes the priority, connection becomes secondary. That's why it feels like a nightmare. Because no matter how much you care, no matter how much you try, the structure of the interaction itself keeps producing the same emotional outcome: distance, frustration, and exhaustion. And here's the final piece, the one that brings everything into focus. This dynamic doesn't persist because people don't care. It persists because they don't understand the patterns they're participating in. They keep trying harder within the same framework instead of stepping outside it. But once you see it clearly, once you recognize the push, the pull, the boundaries, the pursuit, you have a choice. You can continue reacting, or you can start responding with awareness. Because real connection doesn't come from intensity or distance alone. It comes from alignment, of pace, of boundaries, of emotional capacity. And without that alignment, even the strongest feelings won't be enough. So the question you're left with is not, who's at fault? But something far more powerful. Are you creating connection, or are you unconsciously recreating the very pattern that keeps it out of reach? So when you bring all of this together, the avoidance fear of emotional exposure, the toxic empath's intensity disguised as care, the relentless pursuit, the collapse of boundaries, and the push-pull cycle, you start to see something with absolute clarity. This was never just about two people. It was about two protective systems colliding. One protects by creating distance. The other protects by creating closeness. And when those two strategies meet without awareness, they don't balance each other. They destabilize each other. That's why it feels so intense. That's why it feels so confusing. And that's why for both people, it can feel like a nightmare you can't quite wake up from. Because no matter what you do within that dynamic, more effort, more space, more analysis, it keeps leading you back to the same place: disconnection. But here's where everything shifts. The moment you stop asking, how do I make this person respond differently? And start asking, what pattern am I participating in? You move from reaction to awareness. And awareness is where all real change begins. Because you cannot build a healthy connection on unconscious patterns. You cannot create trust by overriding boundaries. You cannot create safety by avoiding vulnerability. And you cannot create intimacy by forcing it into existence. Real connection requires something far more demanding and far more honest. It requires self-awareness. It requires emotional responsibility. It requires the willingness to recognize not just what you feel, but how you behave when you feel it. And most importantly, it requires alignment. Alignment in pace, alignment in boundaries, alignment in how both people define safety and connection. Because without that, even the strongest attraction will turn into friction. Even the deepest care will turn into pressure. Even the best intentions will produce the worst outcomes. So this is the real takeaway, the one that matters beyond this dynamic, beyond this label, beyond this specific pattern. You don't heal relationships by trying harder within dysfunction. You heal them by understanding the system that creates the dysfunction in the first place. And once you see it, truly see it, you're no longer trapped inside it. You have a choice to keep repeating the cycle or to finally break it.